Imagine pointing a camera at a single, unchanging patch of Earth at the very southern tip of Manhattan Island, pressing record and letting the film roll for 400 years without ever moving the lens. What you would witness through that fixed frame is not just the construction of a city, but the most astonishing, relentless, and violent transformation of land in human history. You would see a pristine, forested island inhabited by Native Americans, violently carved up by Dutch colonists, transformed into a British military outpost, leveled to build a rigid grid of streets, buried under millions of tons of concrete and steel to erect the world's first skyscrapers, nearly abandoned in a spiral of crime and bankruptcy in the 20th century, and ultimately resurrected into a glittering, hyper-expensive vertical fortress of glass. New York City is not just a place. It is an organism, a relentless machine that constantly eats its own history to build its future. It is a city built on top of itself, layer upon layer, where the ghosts of the past are quite literally buried beneath the subway tracks you ride on every day. Welcome to the U.S. Lens. Today we are compressing 4 centuries of greed, ambition, engineering marvels, and human suffering into a sweeping, fixed-camera time-lapse. This is the entire evolution of New York City. If we start our time-lapse in the year 1624, the image we see is completely unrecognizable. There are no skyscrapers, no paved roads, no concrete. Instead, the southern tip of Manhattan is a lush, hilly, marshy paradise covered in dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine. The air smells of sea salt and wet earth. This land belongs to the Lenape people, who have lived harmoniously with this ecosystem for centuries, fishing in the abundant oyster beds that were so massive they literally shaped the coastline. But the lens captures the arrival of a different kind of energy. A Dutch ship drops anchor, and the Dutch West India Company establishes a small, fortified trading post called New Amsterdam. Through our fixed camera, we watch as the pristine landscape is brutally chopped down. The Dutch are not here to build a utopia. They are here to make money, primarily through the highly lucrative fur trade of beaver pelts. We see a muddy dirt road forming, which the Dutch call Breed Weg, translating to Broadway. We see them building a crude wooden wall stretching across the northern edge of their settlement to keep out the British and Native Americans. That defensive wall would eventually be torn down, but the dirt path running alongside it would be paved over and immortalized forever as Wall Street. Even in these earliest days, New Amsterdam is a chaotic, rough-and-tumble port town filled with sailors, merchants, and slaves, reflecting a deeply capitalist, diverse, and pragmatic spirit that never really left the city. As our time-lapse fast-forwards to 1664, the Dutch flag is lowered and the British flag is raised, officially renaming the settlement New York. Under British rule, the physical transformation of the island begins to accelerate. The dense forests are steadily replaced by docks, warehouses, taverns, and churches. New York becomes a vital hub for the British Empire, heavily reliant on the horrific transatlantic slave trade. In fact, for much of the 18th century, New York City had the highest concentration of enslaved people outside of the South, doing the brutal physical labor of building the very foundations of the city. As we move our time-lapse into the late 18th century, the city becomes a primary battleground for the American Revolution. In 1776, a massive fire tears through the wooden structures of Lower Manhattan, reducing a massive swath of the city to smoking ash, a devastating moment captured in our lens as the city literally burns to the ground. The British occupy the city for 7 years, turning it into a fortified military camp. But when the British finally leave in 1783, New York begins an explosive rebirth. By 1789, our fixed camera watches as a massive crowd gathers outside Federal Hall on Wall Street to watch George Washington take the oath of office as the first president of the United States. At this moment, New York is the capital of the new nation, but it is still a relatively small, densely packed, chaotic seaport of roughly 30,000 people, defined by winding, crooked streets that followed old cow paths and colonial property lines. But the 19th century is when New York City begins its metamorphosis into a modern metropolis, driven by two unimaginably massive projects. First is the 1811 Commissioner's Plan. Looking through our camera, we witness an act of sheer, audacious engineering. The city planners decide that the chaotic, winding streets of old New York are inefficient for business. They propose a radical grid system. Over the next few decades, we watch in fast motion as entire hills on Manhattan are literally blasted away with gunpowder, and the earth is used to fill in massive marshes along the coasts. The natural, hilly topography of the island is completely obliterated, flattened into a rigid, unforgiving grid of 12 avenues and 155 streets, stretching all the way up the island. It is a triumph of capitalism over nature, creating a blank canvas for developers. The second massive catalyst is the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. This man-made river connects the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, effectively making New York City the primary port for all the agricultural and industrial wealth of the American Midwest. Through our lens, we see the harbor explode with activity. Hundreds of masted ships crowd the waters. Massive warehouses spring up along the west side. New York becomes the undisputed financial and commercial capital of the United States, eclipsing Boston and Philadelphia overnight. As the mid-19th century arrives, our time-lapse captures a demographic earthquake. The Great Famine in Ireland and political revolutions in Germany send millions of impoverished immigrants across the Atlantic. Through our fixed camera, we watch thousands of exhausted, desperate people flooding off the docks of Lower Manhattan every single day. The city's population absolutely explodes. To house these masses, greedy developers build grim, cramped, poorly ventilated tenement buildings in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and the infamous 5 Points. Our camera captures the squalor, the laundry hanging between buildings, the narrow, garbage-filled alleys teeming with disease, crime, and gang violence. It is a time of extreme wealth, juxtaposed with extreme poverty. While the newly rich industrialists and railroad barons are building spectacular, opulent mansions along Fifth Avenue, just a few blocks away, immigrants are living in conditions that rival the worst slums of London. But these immigrants are the muscle that builds the new city. We see them pickaxing the bedrock to build the foundations for a new kind of architecture. As we enter the late 19th century, the limits of the island force the city to grow vertically. The invention of the safety elevator and the development of steel frame construction change everything. Through our time-lapse lens, we watch in awe as the first skyscrapers begin to pierce the skyline of Lower Manhattan. Buildings like the Tribune Tower and the Western Union Building shoot upward, blocking out the sun on the narrow streets below. In 1883, we watch the monumental opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, an engineering marvel of suspension cables and stone towers that finally connects Manhattan to Brooklyn, formally consolidating the massive, sprawling metropolis. A few years later, in 1886, our camera captures the arrival of a massive French gift, the Statue of Liberty, standing boldly in the harbor, her torch acting as a beacon for the millions more immigrants who will soon arrive at the newly opened Ellis Island. By the end of the 19th century, the once green island has been completely smothered in a dense, chaotic canopy of brick, stone, and smoke. The Gilded Age has turned New York into a sprawling, polluted, magnificent behemoth, the second largest city in the world, defined by extreme inequality and relentless industrial noise. As the time-lapse rolls into the early 20th century, the pace of change becomes almost dizzying. The introduction of the automobile begins to choke the narrow, gridlocked streets originally designed for horse-drawn carriages. To solve the congestion, the city goes underground. In 1904, our fixed camera captures the opening of the New York City subway. We watch as massive crowds of people descend into the earth, and the city suddenly expands outward. Neighborhoods in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens that were once rural farmland are instantly connected to the dense core of Manhattan, causing an explosion of residential development. The 1920s bring the Jazz Age. Through our lens, the skyline of Midtown Manhattan undergoes a vertical race to the clouds. The Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and finally, in 1931, the Empire State Building dominate the frame. New York is the undisputed capital of the world, a glamorous Art Deco metropolis filled with speakeasies, Broadway theaters, and roaring stock markets. But the high times crash violently. The Great Depression of the 1930s plunges the city into despair. Our camera watches as bread lines stretch for blocks. Shanty towns known as Hoovervilles spring up in Central Park, and the construction cranes come to a halt. The mid-20th century brings a different kind of transformation. After World War II, the city experiences a brief boom, but it is quickly overshadowed by the rise of the automobile and a man named Robert Moses. Moses is an unelected urban planner who holds unprecedented power for decades. Through our time lapse, we watch his devastating legacy unfold. To accommodate the car, Moses slashes massive sunken concrete highways directly through vibrant, working-class neighborhoods, tearing apart communities and displacing hundreds of thousands of people, particularly in the Bronx. The city's middle class, lured by the promise of suburban homes and automobile ownership, begin a massive exodus to Long Island and New Jersey, a phenomenon known as white flight. As the tax base shrinks, the city begins a slow, agonizing decline. By the 1970s, the view through our fixed camera is bleak, gritty, and terrifying. New York City is on the verge of bankruptcy. The subway cars are covered inside and out in layers of vibrant, chaotic graffiti. Crime rates skyrocket. Times Square, once a glamorous theater district, devolves into a neon-lit nightmare of peep. Shows, drug dealers, and seedy hotels. The city feels abandoned by the government, left to burn in the summer of 1977 during a massive blackout that triggered widespread looting. In this decade, New York is portrayed in movies as a dystopian, lawless wasteland, a far cry from the glittering metropolis it once was. But the time-lapse shows that New York's greatest skill is reinvention. In the 1980s and 90s, the tide begins to turn. Aggressive policing policies, a booming Wall Street economy, and a massive influx of a new generation of artists and immigrants slowly clean up the streets. The graffiti is scrubbed off the subways. The crime rate drops dramatically. Times Square is sanitized, transformed into a sanitized, corporate-friendly tourist destination filled with massive neon billboards and chain stores. The 1990s bring the digital revolution and the dot-com boom, flooding the city with immense wealth. However, just as the city feels like it has regained its footing, the time-lapse captures the most traumatic morning in its history. On September 11, 2001, our fixed camera watches in horror as two hijacked commercial airplanes fly directly into the twin towers of the World Trade Center. The towers, which had defined the southern skyline for decades, burn, intensely and then catastrophically collapse into a mountain of toxic dust and twisted steel. It is a moment of profound trauma, leaving a massive gaping void in the lower Manhattan skyline and a deep psychological scar on the city. In the final years of our time-lapse, covering the early 21st century, we witness the most dramatic and controversial transformation yet. Driven by immense global wealth and foreign investment, New York City enters an era of hyper-gentrification. The camera watches as the remaining industrial warehouses and gritty working-class neighborhoods are rapidly demolished and replaced by towering, ultra-luxury glass residential skyscrapers. The skyline of the Hudson Yards area, once a rail yard, explodes upward with futuristic glass structures. A new, towering One World Trade Center rises from the ashes of Ground Zero, reclaiming the skyline. But this new era comes at a heavy cost. The New York City of the 21st century, as seen through our lens, is cleaner, safer, and more visually spectacular than ever before, but it has also lost much of its soul. The bohemian artists, the diverse working-class families, and the gritty edge that once defined the city have been priced out and pushed to the fringes. The city is increasingly becoming a playground for the ultra-wealthy, a vertical suburb where massive luxury condos sit half-empty, bought by billionaires as investment properties. As our 400-year time-lapse finally comes to an end and the footage stops, the contrast between the first frame and the last frame is almost incomprehensible. The quiet, forested hill of the Lenape people has been replaced by a towering 8-million-person concrete canyon that literally bends the geography of the island to its will. Through the U.S. lens, the evolution of New York City is the ultimate, unfiltered story of American capitalism. It is a story of incredible human ambition, engineering genius, and the ability to welcome the tired, poor, and huddled masses of the world to build a new life. But it is also a story of ruthless greed, the destruction of nature, the displacement of the vulnerable, and the constant, brutal cycle of tearing down the old to build the new. New York City is not a static place. It is a living, breathing entity that is never finished. It is a city that is constantly eating itself, constantly rebuilding and constantly reaching higher into the sky, forever driven by the unshakable belief that the best is always yet to come.